I first want to thank you for joining us today at 12 o'clock. Welcome to the University of Southern California Institute for Integrative Health and Wellness Quarterly Symposium. We're very excited to be presenting our topic today about recreational activities. The mission of our USC IIHW is to promote the health and healing of individuals, families, and communities we serve through the advancement and practice of integrative health and the science upon which it is based, and the education and healthcare practitioners and the USC community. Our vision is to transform healthcare by establishing a collaborative, holistic paradigm that promotes health and healing and integrates all aspects of human life: physical, emotional, mental, spiritual, cultural, social, and environmental. Next slide. It's very important that we include a land acknowledgement for the individuals who have previously occupied these lands, our ancestors, and the ancestors of this country from which we're speaking at USC and also at Children's Hospital Los Angeles. It's very important that we recognize our elders, those who came before us, and pay our respects to them. Many of the native tribes are listed here on the slide, including the Chumash, the Tavarium, Serrano, Kahuli, and Chuan. I will also let you read them because I don't like to mispronounce the names of the ancient tribes that existed here. So please read the slide. And we want to pay homage to those who came before us. Next slide. Again, for using EADS for continuing medical education, you can click on this QR code here and use the code 18SLAW. If you don't already have an account, you can just access it this way. And those instructions are also in the chat, so feel free to access that. Next slide, please. I want to acknowledge our executive steering committee here at USC and at Children's Hospital Los Angeles, who supports the efforts of USC IIHW, which is based at the Office of Religious and Spiritual Life at USC at the University Park campus. Thank you, everybody, for all the work that you do. Next slide. Coming to a screen near you, we'll be completing our mini-series on psychedelics, looking at psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy. That will probably be happening in the month of either later this month, March, or April, or beginning of May. We're organizing that right now. So we hope that you'll be able to tune into that. Next slide, please. All right, wonderful. So again, thank you for being here today. I'm going to pass the leadership and the baton over to Dr. George Salem, who will be presenting and introducing all of our discussants today and our presenters today. Look forward to a very active discussion following our 1 hour of presentations with an active Q&A. Again, you can put your questions into the Q&A section of the chat. And again, look forward to hearing our presenters. Thank you so much for being here today, and look forward to a very active discussion at the end. Thanks very much. I pass it over to you, Dr. Salem.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Appreciate the introduction. And thank you all for joining us for our symposium today, The Mind and Body Benefits of Recreational Exercise. My name is George Salem. I'll be the moderator today. I am a researcher in the Division of Biokinesiology and Physical Therapy at the University of Southern California. Our speakers today include Jonathan Casper, Garry and Dr. Susan Harris, and I'll be introducing them individually in just a bit. We've all heard about the importance of exercise, how exercise can increase our longevity as well as our quality of life. Unfortunately, few of us get the recommended amount of exercise per week. And that's because exercise is somewhat burdensome. It takes time, it may take money, travel, et cetera, et cetera. So in recognizing this, I've spent the better part of the last 30 years studying exercise and trying to reduce the burden of exercise. One way to do that is to try and understand different exercise activities that perhaps target multiple muscle groups rather than just a single muscle group or a single joint. So activities such as squatting and sit to stand activities. We've examined stair climbing and lunging activities. We've even looked at the effects of wearing a weighted vest with the idea that by just wearing this weighted vest during activities of daily living, we could load the musculoskeletal system and for the benefits of exercise, including increased fitness and balance. Unfortunately, our study didn't work very well because people chose to wear the weighted vest primarily when they were watching TV rather than when they were out walking, shopping, doing these other things. So we learned that you need to prescribe activities along with the weighted vest rather than just wearing a weighted vest. We also spent quite a bit of time looking at the mechanics associated with yoga poses. Here we see 3 individuals performing their yoga poses in a motion analysis laboratory. And our goal here was to understand what these poses actually did, the muscle groups they targeted, the joints they targeted, so that programs could be put together which were more efficient and when were not redundant, and that we could order the asanas in a manner which was safe and most effective. Because of this work, I was invited by the American College of Sports Medicine, which is the largest exercise science organization in the world, to co-author a position stand. That position stand was titled "The Exercise and Physical Activity for Older Adults." And I was fortunate to be co-authors with this group of very famous exercise researchers. Those of you who are in exercise science will probably recognize some of these names: Maria Fiatrone-Singh, James Skinner, Claudio Nigg, etc. Honestly, I experienced a little bit of imposter syndrome being included in this group. I was very thankful that I was. And what we concluded at this paper, and what we recommended for primarily older adults, is that older adults should get this amount of exercise. They should get 150 minutes of cardiorespiratory activities. That would be walking or swimming or cycling. But then in addition, 2 to 3 days a week, they should include some strength and power training, flexibility training, and functional balance training. Now that's a lot of exercise, and for me, quite burdensome. And we didn't even touch upon a couple other important components associated with exercise. That's psychosocial health and brain health. Now then, how can we manage this? How can we reduce the burden of this huge amount of exercise that we're recommending for older adults and for younger adults as well? And the answer that we've come up and the researchers here are going to discuss is recreational exercise. Recreational activities often check a majority of these circles. Some activities may check all of these activities. We're going to hear about golf in particular. And so recreational exercise, we feel, is a way in which individuals can get the recommended dosage of exercise throughout a week. Moreover, recreational exercise has additional benefits. Research has shown that adherence to these types of programs are much higher than individual weightlifting, endurance, etc. exercises. And in fact, we believe that one of the reasons that recreational activities are so inherent is that they're fun, and that individuals, rather than experiencing exercise, are actually playing these different activities. In fact, in retrospect, if I had to rename, or if I could rename the title of this symposium, I'd call it "The Mind and Body Benefits of Recreational Play." With that introduction, I'm now going to turn the symposium over to Dr. Jonathan Casper. Dr. Casper is an associate professor at the College of Natural Resources at North Carolina State University. Jonathan.
Thank you, George. And I'm trying to share my screen and I'm about to do it right now. All right. Do you guys see the presenter view or the other view? If I can get someone to let me know.
Presenter view.
Okay, I had to just do that really. I'm sorry. Okay, all right. I'm going to be talking about pickleball today and some of the physical and psychosocial benefits that are associated with it, specifically for older adults. And in this case, I'm focusing on those that are 65 and over for most of the cases. And I'll first just start out by talking about what I'm going to try and achieve today, which is a lot, but I'm going to talk about recognizing how pickleball participation helps meet CDC physical activity guidelines, or also the guidelines similar to what George just stated that he does with the American College of Sport Medicine. Identify some of the motivations and constraints that are related to older adult pickleball participation, and then also how participation contributes to social and psychological well-being. So I got a lot to do here in less than 15 minutes, so I'll try and accomplish it as fast as possible. But if you're not familiar with pickleball, it's probably unusual if you're not familiar with pickleball, but I brought in a couple of props here. This is my pickleball paddle and this is my pickleball ball, and that's all I need. That is all I need to play pickleball. And so it's the fastest growing sport in the United States. We're seeing it played both indoors and outdoors. One thing that really appeals to me about this sport is that we see it in public recreation. And so you're able to see this at a lot of the parks and recreation centers. In this case, when we're talking about older adults and seniors, senior centers. And so it is one that can be played in a variety of different places. It's primarily played doubles in most cases, but it can be played in singles. It's very age appropriate, and we're seeing a lot of intergenerational play. It's pretty easy to learn. As a matter of fact, you can probably learn the skills and be able to play the sport in one session, which is really something that's special about the sport. The hardest thing to learn about the sport is probably how to keep track of scoring, because it's even more complicated than tennis, I think, in many ways. But it's very appealing, and that's why it's growing, is because it's such an easy sport. And as I go to talk a little bit about the research here, I don't want to be talking about how pickleball is better or in comparison to any other sports. All I'm talking about is how sport contributes to physical and psychosocial health through the actual sport itself. So there's no comparisons here, just trying to talk about some of the research that I've found. I'm going to focus mostly on what I've done so far. So the first thing I want to talk about is the physical activity associated with it. So George mentioned some of the physical activity guidelines. The CDC has very similar guidelines to what George talked about, but at least 150 minutes per week of moderate intensity activity, such as brisk walking, or less, so 75 minutes of vigorous activity such as hiking, jogging, or running. And so what we did with a initial study is we actually put some Fitbits, and actually I'm wearing the one that they wore. So it was a very thin Fitbit, and we had participants that are 65 and over basically wear these Fitbits for 2 weeks, day and night. So they wore them, but also indicated the time and days that they played pickleball. So we were able to isolate pickleball play. And what we found is that my biggest concern, and because I do play pickleball, was you see there's a lot of standing around, and are you getting a lot of physical activity from it? And what we found is that with most of the seniors that participated in the study that I did, and this was a pilot study that had around 37, I believe, total participants. But you do get physical activity. So these are 65 and over participants. They were getting an average of 4,400 steps. They're getting 60 minutes of the MVPA, or moderate to vigorous physical activity. So that was measured based on the number of steps that they were getting over a certain amount of time. The Fitbits also measured heart rate, and so was able to quantify different heart rate zones. The participants averaged 42 minutes in the cardio heart rate zone per playing session and burned over 500 calories. And so what we found here is that, yes, indeed, there are physical activity benefits to playing pickleball. And this is even for those that are older, 65 and over, and are playing doubles. So that was a nice thing to see. Another thing that we found was that since they were wearing it day and night, we found that pickleball participation was one of the keys to attaining any moderate to vigorous physical activity. As a matter of fact, there was only one participant that was getting more MVPA from non-pickleball days versus the days that they did play pickleball. And so we saw that basically on these non-pickleball play days, they rarely were reaching any beneficial cardio zones. And so that those that were playing were getting it mostly from pickleball. The next thing that I've been looking at was, why do you play? So why do they play? And so I did a study back in 2017 that looked at pickleball participants overall. This was age 18 and over, but then isolated some of the findings to those that were 65 and over. And you see that people play because it's fun, right? So George just mentioned that we should be calling it, instead of exercise, play. Well, we see fun being an important reason for it, along with social benefits and the fitness, skill, diversion, and then competition, which is something that's I feel is important. And what we found is that if you were to look at just the 65 year and over category, what we see, and I highlighted them with the red arrows there, is that the key reasons that those that are 65 and over are playing is for enjoyment. So it's fun. It's an opportunity to be for fun. Fitness, so getting some actual physical activity benefit. The skill mastery, and this is important, it's about learning new skills. When as you age, and especially as you become a senior, sometimes you don't have the opportunity to learn new skills. And so pickleball can be a new skill that you learn. And then another important thing is that there's competition. And we forget that basically since the baby boomer generation on, competition has been an important reason for why people play sport. I mean, that's inherent to sport itself. And so having opportunities to compete, even if you're 65 and over, can be important. And we found that those in a different study were the most related to those that continued or were committed to continue to play pickleball. As we looked at what kept people from playing, in the similar study, we found that there were three major ones. So lack of facilities. So this is actually lack of partners, and then lack of time. As we looked at those that were 65 and over specifically, we found that partners and time weren't that big of as big of a constraint. So facilities really was the big one that was keeping a lot of people from wanting to play more. And most of the time, that's a lack of facilities. Part of the problem with being this fast growing sport is that it hasn't grown into having the amount of courts that maybe need to be available. So that was something that became important. Constraints becomes more important as we start to look at other populations. And so this is a recent study that I just concluded, just finished up. So this is, I actually have a paper submitted in the Journal of Aging and Physical Activity. But we looked at pickleball and race. And what we find is that less than about 7% or less of the pickleball participants are African American. And recognizing that the sport is relatively easy to play, understanding that it's played within parks and recreation settings, so it's free to play in most cases. It seems like a great opportunity to have a more diverse participant base, especially when it comes to older adults. And so what we did is we had a Qualtrics study, which is a targeted study, a targeted survey, where to qualify, they had to identify as being Black or African American, had to be 65 years or older, had to have heard of pickleball, so they're aware of pickleball but don't play. And we're wondering, and what we asked them is, why are they not playing? If they've heard of it and aren't playing, why are they not playing? And so the four main constraint factors that we found were lack of knowledge, so not knowing about the sport, even though they've heard of it, not knowing enough about what it actually is, accessibility, not being able to get to the facilities where they are located, interpersonal, meaning not having either family or friends that play, and then a lack of interest, which we can't do a lot about, not just not wanting to play. But what we did is we kind of did some further analysis and MANOVA analysis. We did find two kind of high constrained groups, and those were females, and then also those that reported low physical activity, or in this case, did not meet the CDC standards for physical activity. So what we found is that females had some unique constraints. We found that knowledge was an important one, but also psychological, not feeling like they were able to. So feeling like they're not good enough, not good at sports, not coordinated enough, where it was important, as well as costs. And that's an important one because, as I mentioned, cost really shouldn't be a constraint. So there's a perception that there are costs for females. This was the same thing for those that reported low physical activity. Again, not feeling that they were able to play, having a perception of costs. And then one that we found that was kind of unique was feeling not comfortable at the courts, feeling that there was perceived racism, that the pickleball courts weren't a welcome environment if you were Black. And so that had some other implications that I could talk about if I had more time. So the next part that I wanted to focus on is some of the social and psychological well-being. And I am not alone in studying pickleball and the benefits to social and psychological health, especially when it comes to older adults, because we know, and we see this from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, I'm messing up with the name there, and the CDC, but there are some real concerns as far as you get older, are you maintaining social connections or even increasing if it's possible? How does that relate to how you feel about yourself? How do you feel about life? Is there increased loneliness? All of those become increased concerns, which I think many people that are maybe listening to this probably even know more than me about. But what we did find is that if you do play pickleball, it is a sport where you can make new friends or new social connections. And what we found is that this isn't just specific to playing pickleball, but these are social connections that are made and then continue during non-pickleball playtime. So for example, going out and having coffee or doing something social in addition to playing pickleball with these new social connections. Another thing is that it helps with happiness through social capital, and the fact that by generating more friends and creating more social capital, you feel better about yourself. From a psychological, and these kind of overlap, but we know that by having these unique, fun experiences, that helps with how you feel about yourself and your psychosocial well-being. Again, I mentioned this a little bit, but pickleball was one of the very few activities that people reported having an opportunity to compete. And that isn't wanting to win and the feelings of this, I won, I'm great, but having the chance to feel like you're able to compete, which is very rare. And then another important thing is helping with depression and certain emotions that might come up as aging naturally happens, especially, for example, the transition to retirement. Part of a study that we did, and this was linked to the physical activity studies. It was almost a natural experiment. We were conducting the research on physical activity, and then COVID happened. And so when COVID happened, we actually were able to follow up with the participants that had been playing, and we found that like everyone, it caused lower social connections. They weren't able to play pickleball and weren't able to meet with people, but their perceived physical health was stable, so they didn't feel like they were getting worse as far as physical health. A lot of it, when we followed up with interviews, was because they were doing other things. They were going for walks more. So they replaced the pickleball with a different activity, but they also reported lower mental health and loneliness. All the things that we were worried about with COVID actually were happening. But those that actually were able to play pickleball, so when the parks were opened again, partially at least for outdoor play, or some of the participants were really inventive and played in their driveways or in their neighborhood cul-de-sacs. But those that were continuing to play versus those that stopped playing pickleball were significantly more likely to report those that didn't play pickleball reported significantly lower life satisfaction. So it's not a cause and effect, but we found that by playing pickleball, life satisfaction seemed to be more stable. So that's all I've got. I have a list of references, and I'll just leave that up for a few seconds, and then I'm going to stop sharing. All right, I'll turn it over to Gary or George.
Thank you, Jonathan. That was excellent. And we've got a couple questions for you. We'll get to following the other two talks. So our next presenter is Garry Kai. Garry is a doctoral student. He's actually my doctoral student in the Division of Biokinesiology and Physical Therapy at the University of California. Gary's going to be talking about golf and the benefits, mind and body benefits associated with golf play. Garry?
Thank you for the introduction, Dr. Salem. Everybody able to see my slides okay? Okay, perfect.
Yes.
So thank you so much, obviously, for this opportunity to present my work here. I really appreciate this platform so we could share our research on golf. My team and I always are intrigued by the conversations that are generated at these talks because I understand that golf does have a certain reputation in the US, and it could be controversial from time to time. So hopefully today we'll address some of those questions and present golf as in its essence, which is a recreational activity or sport. So start with a bit of an icebreaker. I want to pose this question. What is your first thought when you hear the phrase playing golf? Right, could mean different things to different people. Golf can be played like this. You see Mr. John Daly here having the time of his life out on the course, riding in an electric cart while smoking a cigarette and drinking a Diet Coke, I presume. And golf could also be played like this, more like a recreational social activity with walking the course and pushing your own equipment with a group of friends. I could also even be played like this with the latest gadget where it looks like it's a golf surfboard. It can also be played on a very flat surface or a very hilly course. The point I'm trying to illustrate here is that there's a wide spectrum of demands associated with playing golf, depending on where and how you choose to play the sport. So today we'll be mainly focusing on this type of golf play. Here is a chronological view of the research on golf and health in the last 2 decades. I know it's a really dense slide. There are lots of information up here. These are 11 studies that I listed since the year 2000. I think these are really important for golf and health research. And they kind of tell us this view that golf researchers have shifted from earlier, mostly focusing on the walking and the other physical activity that's within golf, to now we're more paying attention to the psychosocial health and the cognitive brain health of things, much more of the mind-body holistic approach. And I'll illustrate that in the next slide. Here you've seen something really similar before from Dr. Salem's introduction. Like I said, the early 2000 studies looked into the walking associated with golf. There's a large amount of walking. Golf swing, that's always been a really hot topic in research, especially in biomechanics, because people want to get better performance and reduce the risk of injury, mostly for the serious golfers, athletes, etc. And there's this squatting activity that also occurs on the course where you bend down to the ground and you tee up the ball or pick up the ball. And you also have putting, which require other short game activities that requires more neuromuscular function and challenges your balance. And in the last 10 years or so, we actually have a couple of pretty large studies that use golf as intervention to look at cognitive health, mainly with memory and attention. So you are in golf, you're always planning your next move, you're planning your next shot, calculating distance, wind, grass type, all sorts of things, and you're mindful of others around you. So it has a high cognitive demand. Also, it is play in an outdoor green environment with sun exposure. So that has on itself has its own benefits to health. And with this whole package, we see this phenomenon that golf is highly adherent. People who get into golf tend to stick with it for a long time. And of course, golf can be played to your 70s, 80s, and even 90s in some cases. So with that in mind, our research team have conducted 2 recent studies. The first one is was a 12-week study done in older adult veterans in a little more controlled group and environment. And the second study was done in general public, healthy older adults. A couple of highlights from these studies: we were actually able to recruit all non-golfers, so people who have never golfed before. They were able to teach them within a time frame of 12 to 10 weeks. And some of our participants were up to 80 years old. So now let's talk about some data from our last study. Here I kind of sum up what it really means to play 9 holes of golf. Usually a full round of golf is 18 holes. So this is what you call half a round, or maybe to some people, this could be their full round. But it takes about 90 minutes to play 9. Pushing their own set of golf clubs, equipment. And it counts to about 40 golf swings in total, 30 putting strokes, and squatting about 25 times. And one thing that we weren't able to really capture just by observing our participants and using wearable technologies like Fitbits was that the slope or the undulation of the course, if you will. So we took a look on I took a topographical analysis of the course that we play, which is the Monterey Park Golf Course. And you can see here in this graph below is the slope of the course from this straight line that I drew from tee to green of each hole. So if you take a look at these up and downs, they roughly translate to going at least up and down 11 flights of stairs. And this is going in a straight line. And of course, no golfer really walks a straight line ever on a golf course. You always hit the ball sideways, even the best of us do. So we add that 11 flights of stairs up and down into the mix, and all of a sudden you have a much higher intensity to the 90-minute session. And of course, as laid out before, we have the cognitive challenges of playing your shots, calculating your next move, basically, and being mindful of other participants in your group. Then it's in a social environment, in an outdoor green environment with sun exposure. So with all that components of golf in mind, it's not surprising that we see this improvement in balance, right? Your balance is constantly being challenged by the golf swing and walking on uneven terrain. So we've seen in our studies and others that improvement of static and dynamic balance measured by different tasks and also joint proprioception. Also, other physical health outcomes that also improve are like leg power, grip strength, time up and go test performance, and also walking speed. And cognition improvement can be probably attributed to the combination of these cognitive tasks and physical activity happening at the same time. There are a couple of larger randomized control trials that that have tested and shown that a golf intervention can improve attributes of memory and attention, along with our own study results also show that. And for mental health, we have a little less quantitative information on these topics, of course, but we do have some qualitative results to show. For our exit survey, our participants stated a couple of themes of reduced stress, improved memory. A lot of participants stated a reduction in stress level and anxiety. For social health, a couple of themes that were identified were really the friendship aspect and the confident aspect that they improved after our program. And this psychosocial support theme has been also found in other group exercise studies, such as dancing and soccer. People think of them as kind of like Dr. Casper already alluded to before. These are alternate forms of support with a lot more goal orientation and the competition, which is less formal, and they have been shown to improve physical and mental health. And this green outdoor environment with sun exposure has been shown to be beneficial to physical activity, motivation, bone health via vitamin D level, and also golfers have been shown to report higher self-reported health and much less depression rate. So in our studies, the two pilot studies before, we were able to attain over 90% attendance in our training sessions. Throughout, we had no injuries or dropouts. We were able to attract a really diverse cohort of non-golfers, so people who had never golfed before, and you can see by this racial distribution here. In our most recent study, we were also able to attract 50% even split of male and females. So we can see that golf here actually is able to attract a really diverse cohort. There's also a recent 20-year cohort study that looked into people's sports participation in their midlife, in their middle age, and how that predicts their sports participation into their older years. And golf is among the strongest predictor for long-term physical activity participation and being active in the old age, along with other sports such as bowling, cricket, and running. So I talked about all these benefits. What about some of the barriers? Of course, we recognize some of that with being time, money, and other practical factors such as transportation. So in our research, we found that within 30-mile radius of downtown Los Angeles, there are more than 20 public golf courses that cost anywhere between $5 to $20 to play for 9 holes, and there are probably additional discounts for senior citizens. And all these could be accessed through online open source platforms such as Golf Now, or just by going to the golf courses themselves. So with that, the future of golf, we believe we should come up with some more standardized measurement of demands across the diverse course profile and also style of play. Golf has also been recommended for cancer survivors, particularly prostate cancer survivors, and have been tested in some other people with cognitive diseases such as Alzheimer's, stroke, and Parkinson's disease. But these studies are pretty few, and the foremost investigations are very few and far between. With that in mind, that's why our team is planning to go into the prostate cancer survivor route, because first of all, the age group really match our age group of interest and with our previously studied age group. Also, if you take a look at the list of the symptoms that they combat here, a lot of them overlap with the known benefits of golf. So we really believe that a specifically designed for prostate cancer survivor golf intervention program could benefit their quality of life during survivorship. So with our short-term goal, we want to test that project. And the long-term goal, we would like to set up these kind of projects around the nation, not only for prostate cancer survivors, but for other types of cancer survivors that experience similar symptoms. And this probably is the last slide, but it's probably one of the most important slides because I've covered a lot of topics, but we've established that golf is a really highly adherent sport with physical, cognitive, and psychosocial benefits. It combines physical activity and cognitive tasks in an outdoor and social environment that's fun, which is probably why we see that all the benefits associated with it. The feasibility of golf, we were able to teach our participants in a relatively short amount of time, 10 to 12 weeks. And that, I show you some of the stats before of the cost of playing golf is probably a little lower than what is popularly believed. The future of golf, I believe, is really important to educate. That's why I really appreciate this kind of platform to be able to share my research, application of it to different clinical population. Of course, we have to study the barriers to participating in this activity. And finally, we really require community collaboration in order to deliver this sport to a broader audience. With that, I do thank you very much for your time and work from my team here. I'll leave this up for a minute, and then I will also turn it back over to Dr. Salem.
Thank you, Gary. That was very informative. I think we've got a couple questions for you as well, and we'll address those in just a little bit. Our next speaker is Dr. Susan Harris. Dr. Harris is a professor emeritus at the Department of Physical Therapy at the University of British Columbia. She's a very famous and well-known researcher in the realm of physical therapy. She's going to be talking about a unique activity, one that I had never heard of just 2 years ago, and that's dragon boat racing. So, Susan.
Thanks, George. I'd like to thank the symposium organizers for inviting me. I think what they wanted was to enhance the diversity of the panel by including an elderly female from Canada. But I'm absolutely delighted to be here. And you can see the title of my talk. And I will move ahead. Maybe I will. I will move ahead, Nat, to the next slide. These are the objectives, and they're not too difficult. We're going to talk about the origins of dragon boat racing, which is pretty interesting. Particularly describe why the exercise involved in this sport was contraindicated for many years for women who'd been treated for breast cancer. And then, like the other speakers, give examples of both the psychosocial and quality life benefits of dragon boat racing for women with breast cancer. And the next slide, please. Dragon boat racing actually originated in mainland China more than 2,500 years ago. And I think it was Jonathan Casper that said that pickleball was the fastest growing sport in North America. Well, I can tell you that dragon boat racing is the fastest growing water sport in the world. It involves, as you can see here, an all-out sprint by 18 to 22 paddlers sitting side by side. And it's a very, very heavy 40 to 60 foot boat that travels in the racing for 500 to 650 meters. Now, the first International Dragon Boat Festival that was held outside of China actually took place in Vancouver in 1996. And that happens to be the one in which we first paddled. What's particularly interesting and poignant is that I have a book about the history of dragon boat racing. And when it started 2,500 years ago, the point was that the dragon boats were traditionally raced from the north, which is the region of death, to the south, the realm of life. So what could be more relevant for cancer survivors than that? And the next slide, please. This is most of our original crew. We ranged in age from 31 to 63, so really more of a middle-aged group than an elderly group. And the name of our team, as you've seen, is Abreast in a Boat, and that's a double entendre, because dragon boat paddlers sit to abreast in the boat, but many of these paddlers had only one breast. Some had no breasts, some had 1.5 breasts if they'd had a lumpectomy or partial mastectomy. So, and the next slide, please. So I'm going to talk a lot about lymphedema, and edema just means a swelling. And in lymphedema, it's caused by the buildup of lymph fluid that usually results from removal of lymph nodes under the arm for the staging of breast cancer. Now, the current incidence of lymphedema is about 4 to 17%, but it was higher than that when we all started in the mid-90s. And that's because we had all had a full axillary dissection. And for example, I had 13 nodes removed from one arm and 17 nodes removed when I had a later breast cancer in the other arm. Whereas in sentinel node biopsy, you have 4 to 5 nodes removed. And many women over the years have stated to me that the fear of lymphedema for them was second only to the fear of recurrence. And the next slide, please. So for years, experts, surgical oncologists, others, preached that vigorous repetitive upper body exercise would increase the risk of getting lymphedema or make pre-existing lymphedema even worse. And the next slide. And Jean Petrick was a very famous surgical oncologist at Memorial Sloan Kettering in New York. And in a review article back in 2000, which was several years after we paddled, she stated that in Arm and Hand Cautions to prevent lymphedema, avoid violent exercise and strenuous exertion. And the next slide. And Erickson, just a year later, in the Journal of the National Cancer Institute, preached similar advice: use the affected arm in moderation, avoid repetitive motion. So in the next slide, please. So here's a bunch of crazy women that are ignoring all of that advice. This photo took place in windy Wellington Harbor, where New Zealanders refer to lumpy waves. There were lots of lumpy waves. And this is Abreast in a Boat competing in the International Dragon Boat Festival in Wellington, New Zealand in February 1998. You'll notice on the front side of the boat, about 2/3 of the way back, the woman with the sunglasses, who is noticeably out of sync with all the other paddlers on her side. That would be yours truly. And that was typically how I paddled. So the next slide, please. So Petrick and colleagues stated, although they talked about these contraindications, they stated that there were no data to govern any of these recommendations and that research was desperately needed. And in the second article, again, no scientific evidence that any of these preventative measures have any effect. And the next slide. So the other physical therapist, actually she was one of our coaches, Sherry Neeson-Vertummen, and I set out to challenge these beliefs by measuring upper extremity circumference. And we did it in both arms, so that we did it in the affected as well as the unaffected arm. In our teammates, all of whom had had axillary dissection, and about 2/3 of whom had radiation. And we were all part of the Dragon Boat study. And And the next slide, please. And we were recruited for this experiment by Dr. Don McKenzie, who is a sports medicine physician and an exercise physiologist at UBC. And he also was is still the Canadian canoe and kayak, the Canadian Olympic canoe and kayak physician. So he wisely put us into an 8-week training program of pumping iron, lifting weights, and so forth to get ready for dragon boat racing before we got on the water. And you'll see this over and over again in other studies about slowly progressive exercise. And the next slide, please. So it always takes a few years to get something published. And why did we choose to publish in a surgical oncology journal? Well, surgical oncologists, breast surgeons, are the ones that were most often warning women about the risks of lymphedema because they were the ones that had removed the lymph nodes. As health professionals, we need to encourage women living with breast cancer to partake in activities like dragon boat racing because it has multiple benefits, as we've seen with the other couple presentations. It promotes their arm strength, it enhances bone density and overall cardiovascular fitness. It's both a resistance and an aerobic exercise. And also, you'll see, really enhances their quality of life. It's especially important for women with breast cancer because many have undergone an early premature menopause because of chemotherapy, and they have consequently a greater risk for heart disease and osteoporosis. And the next slide, please. So we called this a preliminary report because it was a very simple research design. It really is a level 4 evidence level from Sackett. It was a case series involving 20 women that were measured prospectively over 3 periods of time. And we also established reliability of our measures and so forth. And what we concluded was that this sport may be safe to engage in. It may be safe to engage in strenuous, repetitive upper body exercise. And the next slide. And we stated it's a testable hypothesis that must be answered definitively through a prospective, well-controlled trial. So remember, that was published in 2000. It was the first study of its kind, albeit a level 4 study. But look what followed. And the next slide, please. In 2009, Catherine Schmitz and colleagues published in the highly regarded New England Journal of Medicine about a progressive weightlifting program in people that already had lymphedema. And there were no, there not only was increased strength, but their symptoms were reduced, and there were no, there was a decreased incidence of problems related to the lymphedema. Now, in my career, I've never managed to publish in the New England Journal, except for a letter to the editor. But what was wonderful is that Schmitz et al. Cited our study as the first study in this area and referred to us as a hardy group of Canadian breast cancer researchers. So a fledgling group of Canadian breast cancer researchers. So I love that. I love that quote. And the next slide, please. A couple of years later, there was a systematic review which summarizes previous quantitative studies on exercise and lymphedema. And you'll see that about 2/3 of the studies that they cited were involved resistance or aerobic and resistance exercise like dragon boating. And these authors concluded that there is now strong evidence on the safety of slowly progressive resistance exercise without an increased risk of lymphedema. And the next slide. This is one of the most recent papers I could find. These are 2 very well-known physical therapists that I've had the privilege to meet. Karin Johansson is from Sweden. Sandy Hayes is from Australia, and they both published extensively about breast cancer and lymphedema. And they also cited our study as the first. Participating in exercise both during, and that's a lot more common now, and following cancer treatment improves both function and quality of life, and has not been shown to cause or worsen cancer-related lymphedema. So that's a great study too. A review article. Now, quality of life benefits. This is what's called a mixed method study. So there was a quantitative portion where they sent out surveys and they sent out quality of life instruments to, actually this took place in British Columbia, to 14 members of 14 dragon boat teams. And the qualitative portion was taking quotes about what this experience meant to these people. And this was done by Ray and Verhoff in 2013. I love the qualitative quote here. Being on the water is calming. It's beautiful. It's just really wonderful. You're tired, you just feel really good. And the next slide. Another quote, paddling reminds us that we all could have a recurrence, but we also have this immediate support network we can count on. And it's encouraging to see how the crew reacts, how the crew rallies around. This was my own experience in that I didn't experience a recurrence, but I did experience what's called a second primary breast cancer. I was first diagnosed in 1994 with the first breast cancer, which was, I called it my mild case jokingly. It wasn't funny when I got my severe case, but in 1994, I was 46. I knew elderly relatives that had had breast cancer, but I didn't know anybody in my own cohort, my own age group. About 2 months after we came back from paddling in New Zealand in 1998, I was diagnosed with my second breast cancer in the opposite breast, a much more severe one. So I ended up having a bilateral mastectomy and then 6 months of chemotherapy and 5 weeks of radiation. So these are some of my irreverent teammates, particularly the one that I'm hugging, Gail Conantz. Because there were a lot of people on the team that had already had bilateral mastectomy, they managed to share their comments and share and bear their breasts or lack of breasts for me, and that was extremely helpful. So, oh, we're going back or forward. We need to stay back there one more second, Matt. This photo was published in an article in a British Columbia magazine about a breast in a boat. We got lots of publicity. We purposely did. And Gail, my friend there, dubbed this photo "Breastless in Vancouver." So it is a famous photo, breastless in Vancouver. And now the next slide. Thank you. So what did a breast in a boat spawn? And there's our little logo sitting to abreast. Remember, we started in 1994, so that's 29 years ago. And it has grown around the world. And the next slide, please. There are now, and these data are from 2019. I couldn't find any more recent, but there are more than 260 breast cancer dragon boat teams around the world. Just a few of the countries represented of 33. So that means that nearly 6,000 women with breast cancer are gaining the physical and psychosocial benefits from this wonderful sport, which is pretty exciting when you were in the group that got it started. And the last slide, please. This was a photo op. We were really into getting media attention. We risked more than lymphedema climbing out on these rocks, but this is Falls Creek behind, and this was us at our first ever Dragon Boat Festival in 1996. And I want to close by quoting Dr. Don McKenzie, who originated this crazy idea in the first place, and is also the team physician for the Canadian Olympic kayak and canoe teams. What have we learned about exercise in women who have breast cancer? The paddlers all showed a marked improvement in both physical and mental health. Perhaps this improvement is a product of self-selection, but there were no significant side effects. We did not see the cases of lymphedema that we'd been warned about. In terms of impact on patients' lives, it's been the most significant experience of my professional career. And it's certainly been one of the most significant experiences of my personal life. Thanks very much.
Wow. That was really fantastic, Dr. Harris.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for sharing your very personal story as well. Very neat. It's now time for some question and answers. I know I've got a couple for you, Susan. But let's start with our question and answer list. So we have an anonymous attendee. The first question is for Dr. Casper. Dr. Casper, it says, what do you think about the feud between tennis players and pickleball players?
Uh-huh. Well, I think that points to the fact that pickleball grew too big for its britches, maybe a little bit too much, and the fact that the tennis people are a little bit threatened, especially when it comes to the court conversion. And so tennis courts being turned into pickleball courts. And so tennis people will say, oh, the ball's too loud, or it's annoying, or I mean, it's kind of funny if you start looking into that. But the case is that from a public health perspective, if we recognize the health benefits of pickleball, there's a greater case for pickleball specific facilities, which will probably ease some of the tensions between tennis players and pickleball, because tennis is a great sport itself too.
Jonathan, could you discuss the average age of a pickleball player? Is it significantly older than a tennis player?
Pickleball's getting younger. And so that it's becoming more and more of a like cool, fun sport to play for millennials, and as an evening activity instead of going to a bar, going to play pickleball. So we're starting to see it become younger and younger. But right now, I don't have the exact comparison stats to go along with that. But as we look at like the demographics, pickleball is not heavy seniors, but still has quite a few seniors that play. It's about over a third of the participants right now, at least from 2021 stats, are over 65 or senior.
I noticed that
over 55. I'm sorry, over 55.
A lot of retirement communities have not just pickup games, but there's all kinds of tournaments and leagues and things like that.
Yeah, it's socials. So the programming is becoming very similar to tennis. The only thing that was really a difference is that there's a lot more open play in pickleball that I've noticed, where people from a variety of different skill levels are still able to play on the same court, where tennis is a little bit tougher. If you're a 2.5 tennis player and a 5.0, the skill levels are so much different that it's hard to really have a competitive game.
I see. Another question for you, Dr. Casper. Again, an anonymous attendee. Can you speak more about your findings, specifically about the racial disparities you mentioned? You'd like to talk about more if you had more time.
Yeah.
Are you looking into more racial groups who might not be playing pickleball, such as Latino groups?
That's a great point. And the potential for pickleball goes beyond what I mentioned when I was talking about African American and Black. There are a lot of Latino groups that are playing. As far as the stats go, from 2021, this is Sport Fitness Industry Association. 73% of the participants are either Caucasian or white. When I was doing the research, it was 7% African American or Black, but it was 13% Hispanic. And this is only people that played one time or more per year. So it's not the frequent pickleballers per se. But there is a lot of I think benefit, and I'm actually trying to get some research now. Anybody that wants to do research on pickleball, let me know. But I'm trying to actually get some funding to expand that to not just blacks, but also Hispanics, and using faith-based organizations as a way to recruit.
Excellent. Thank you. Our next question is for Garry Kai. And the question is this. This might be out of your scope, but I was wondering, how feasible is golfing as a sport environmentally as global warming and environmental conservatism becomes more of an issue? Can you comment on that, Garry?
Definitely, it is. You're correct. It's definitely outside of my scope, but I'm glad this is brought up because it certainly will be an important issue to address. While I recognize all the challenges in running a golf course and taking so much land, and potential use of chemicals and energy associated with the operation of maintaining a golf course. I think a lot of golf courses also are pretty biodiverse. I don't know if this is answering the question. Like, you do see still a lot of animals and different species of plants and things like that. Or like that is a little bit outside of my scope, but I do know that there are other more environmentally friendly techniques, such as maybe grass that takes less water, or turf and things like that. I also know that there's a push currently with indoor golf, trending it to marketing it to younger adults, like Dr. Casper kind of said. People would rather go to an indoor golf facility and just play indoors and have a drink, or hang out there. So there are other more creative ways to play golf instead of just on the big open field. Of course, you lose a little bit of the benefit of being outdoors in the green environment with the sun exposure, but there are ways around it, and I believe there are a lot of land in the U.S. That are not really being used, and that's a lot of the times where the really good golf courses are. So yeah, if you have more comments about that issue, like please reach out to me. I'd love to have a longer discussion and find out what on that topic.
I've noticed that that the golf industry is certainly sensitive about this topic. They're using recycled water in order to minimize the amount of water they're using, rather than they've stopped the watering of, for example, the rough areas, or other areas where you walk up to they're less interested in flowers and looking pretty, and more interested in trying to conserve water, energy, etc. So I know it is going to be a challenge for the golf industry, and I think more and more we're going to see more sensitivity from the industry as well. Garry, I've heard, and correct me if this is just a rumor, but I've heard that golfers live longer than non-golfers. Is there any truth to that? Is there any evidence that supports that?
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that. There is actually a piece of evidence that was published several years back. One of the studies that I listed is a large cohort study from Sweden. So they have a really complete, as you will, golf tracking system for all people who play golf. So they were able to look at more than 300,000 golfers, and they found that the golf cohort on average do live 5 years longer than the people in the rest of the country who don't play golf. And you might think that people who play golf might already be wealthier and have better access to healthcare and things like that. But in fact, they control for that and factor in the socioeconomic classes, age group, where they live, and sexes of the participants, and they still saw that trend. So it was pretty amazing, but it's a larger study, like I said, with more than 200,000 people. So we don't really know why, but this evidence is out there.
Okay. One last question for you, Garry. It asks whether any of your female participants had breast cancer. I don't recall that any of them did. Do you know if that's the case?
I don't believe so. We did have one male prostate cancer survivors in our study. That's the only cancer survivors or patient that I was aware of. And in fact, he was still going through treatment at the time of being in our program. But I'm not aware of any female cancer survivors in our cohort. We are heading towards that direction.
Dr. Harris, here's a couple questions. Are you aware of any dragon boat groups here in Los Angeles? And what sort of body of water is needed for dragon boat racing?
I'm quite sure there are dragon boat teams in Los Angeles. You can paddle on a river, you can paddle on, Falls Creek is actually comes from the ocean. So it really looks like a river. You can paddle on a lake, you can paddle on the ocean like Windy Wellington Harbor. So as long as it's water, that's fine. And I'm sure I'll look it up, but I'm sure there are teams, breast cancer teams and dragon boaters in LA. Although you've had snow recently.
Right, true. Dr. Harris, I have a question. You talked a little bit about pre-training in preparation for dragon boat racing. And I know this is really important in the golf programs that we've put together. We don't just throw them out and tell them to start swinging a club. We put them through a series of exercises specifically to prepare them for golfing, swinging a club, balance, and those things. Can you talk a little bit about your pre-training and do you feel that's very important before people jump into a dragon boat?
Absolutely. And Don McKenzie and Diana Jesperson put together a great program. Most of us middle-aged women had never been to a gym to pump iron. And so that was new too. But they're wonderful community facilities, very cheap in Vancouver. And, it was predominantly upper extremity. We did reach over, seated one arm extension exercises. We did lat pulls. It's all written up. If anybody's interested, I can send them the exercise stuff. But it was really, really important. And that certainly was reiterated by subsequent studies that there be a pre-training element. So I'm very appreciative of them. We did that twice a week. And then, of course, before each on water experience, once we were paddling, we did, jumping jacks and things like that, range of motion and so forth, particularly upper extremity range of motion.
And here's another question for you, Dr. Harris, regarding the research with survivors after lymphedema. The previous research was confidently against rigorous exercise with little to no actual real life experiences. Is that correct? What caused someone to question this? I think they're getting to the point that why was exercise
Contraindicated.
Yes.
I think it was anecdotal. Well, the other contraindication that was alive when I was first diagnosed was don't wear a sleeve when you travel on an airplane because you'll get lymphedema. Well, I think these were anecdotal. I think somebody was on an airplane and got lymphedema and boom, that threw up. And my physiotherapist told me I shouldn't have raked leaves with my family because she could tell I had lymphedema. She was going to measure me. Well, she'd never measured me before. So I think there were anecdotal experiences that just happened to correspond with the onset of lymphedema, and people just assumed that was positive. And don't carry a heavy purse. This same physiotherapist told one of my friends, dragon boat friends, not to dice vegetables because that was a repetitive upper extremity exercise. So, and she was speaking the wisdom at the time in her defense. So, so I'm not totally sure how it got started, but it certainly persisted. And it's certainly good that sentinel node biopsy has come along because that's decreased the incidence, but it still happens.
Dr. Harris, do you, are your participants wearing compression sleeves?
We wore compression sleeves during training, and we wore compression sleeves because this was brand new and we were going against conventional wisdom. We wore them during paddling the whole first year. And then I think, as you could see, and we'd thrown them away by New Zealand, it probably didn't make a difference. I'm not saying it's not good for people that already have lymphedema, although some of them have thrown them away too. There's really, other than progressive exercise, the study from the New England Journal showing that actually it decreased the ill effects of lymphedema. I don't think there are any other things that are recommended now. I mean, they still have pumps, they put people on pumps and so forth, but I'm not totally up to date with what they're offering now.
Here's a question for everybody. So anybody chime in on this. It's a good question. All three of the presenters talked about recreational sport play that are done outdoors. And Garry talked about the benefits of outdoor physical activity for health and well-being. I'm curious if there are any thoughts about how seasons, weather, climate change, air pollution, and other environmental factors impact the sport play you're studying, and what alternatives you typically recommend for people whose primary mode of physical activity is done outdoors. So Garry, you actually talked a little bit about this. You mentioned indoor golf as one possible solution. Dr. Casper, do you have any thoughts about this? Can you play pickleball in the rain? You probably can't.
Well, it's interesting because where I play pickleball is right next to a highway, so you do have like a concern about air pollution. I've even brought an air pollution monitor, just wondering how bad the pollution is there. It seems to me though, in most cases, people are wanting to play, and those maybe detrimental health effects aren't as outweighed by the benefits of being able to play. But we do have modifications, and you'll see that people will play for example, here it's just brutally hot in the summer, and so if you are playing outside, people will play more. It'll be more morning and evening activity based on that. But with climate change and the temperatures changing and being more dramatic, it's definitely an issue. That's one good thing about pickleball though, is that it can be played indoors in a gym, although then you run into basketball players being mad about pickleball. So there's no winning either way it goes. But it is a concern that the environment and playing outside is a concern, especially pollution.
It's tough to play golf in the snow. So most of the golf courses shut down in the wintertime. So that's going to be problematic if you're using this as an intervention. You're going to have some kind of a substitute. But I will say this, golfers are dedicated and crazy. And it's amazing to me how many are willing to go out in the pouring rain, windy conditions, sloppy greens and fairways just to get in their weekly or bi-weekly golf activities. Dr. Harris, how about, does the weather affect dragon boat racing?
It rains all the time here, so you're used to paddling in the rain. But when we were training for New Zealand, their summer, of course, is our winter, and we were going there in February. So we paddled at night one night a week in the pitch black dark with headlamps on and so forth. So also, I think it was a team from Alberta that used a swimming pool just to practice their strokes. They didn't go very far, but they were in the water and practicing there. So I guess you can sort of do it indoors. But I mean, the most prevalent season here is spring, summer, and fall. But people are out there now paddling their hearts out. So in this climate, that's a little easier.
I'm curious if someone is a breast cancer survivor, how would they go about getting involved in dragon boat racing?
Well, as I mentioned, we got a lot of publicity the first year, and it was actually a journalist that informed our research study, a journalist who said, after I told him that there were no changes between before we started paddling and after, he said, how do you know there won't be long-term effects? And so we had everybody come to the Christmas potluck in tank tops with shirts over so that we could measure their arms again. So we got a lot of publicity. We even had one of the paddlers had a PR friend that took us on. And so we were on national radio, we were on TV. One of the national TV stations made a wonderful documentary of us called Through Fire and Water that aired nationally. So there was a lot out there. so that women are aware of it, certainly, around the world now, as I've said. And there are websites, of course, too. So
Our
and,
our
Excuse-
oncologists aware of it? Are they?
oh yeah, my surgeon would call me at home and say, Dr. Harris, I have a breast cancer referral. I have a dragon boat referral. That was it. So he was wonderful. So he was aware, and we even, one of our surgeons actually ended up steering for one of the boats, and she steered totally off course in one of the races, and so somebody took a picture of that, and she's got it hanging in her office. So yeah, they're certainly well aware of it here, and I think it has gained international attention.
Two more questions. The first one's for you again, Dr. Harris. Does lymphedema develop years later after lymph node dissection, after a period of no lymphedema in women or men?
That I
with
can
breast cancer?
answer. About 80% of cases develop within the first 2 years after treatment. There are, and I meant to say this, but there are sometimes mild cases that happen right away that do resolve, but not usually. And mild cases remain mild, moderate cases remain moderate. It doesn't change. So again, the vast majority happen within the first 2 years. If it develops later on, you also have to look at other possibilities, such as metastasis to the armpit, axilla, and other things like that. You have to investigate it. So, yeah.
And then one final question. This is for everybody, so anybody chime in. It's a very important but general question. How do you encourage older adults in our own lives to go out and do such physical activities? Are there groups available that I can share with patients? So I think you've answered that, Dr. Harris. Garry, Jonathan, do you also want to jump in? Do you have any comments about that? How do we get the word out? How do we get people involved?
So I'll jump in first. I know pickleball is the fastest growing sport in the US, so it probably has a lot of publicity right now. And Dr. Harris mentioned that dragon boat racing is now known across the world, and so great to have team members to help you. But I think golf is a really important question for golf, is that it does get a lot of bad press. It does have a bad reputation of it being a more rich upper class sport. So, but the essence of the sport, as I just broken it down in my talk, it is a multimodal recreational activity that has a lot of health benefits. So how do we get more people to actually play the sport as what it is? It's very important that we have support from the golfing community and from maybe the medical and health and wellness and fitness industry that recognize golf, like what it could do to your patients or even your own health, as people lead more sedentary lifestyles. So yeah, I think this is a great question, and we definitely need the help to start these programs. I know that there are really niche programs that use golf interventions, maybe like some putting, short game programs, like variations of different golf programs or really niche populations, but none are really huge. I guess one that people probably know is the drive, chip, and putt program for kids. A lot of kids can participate in that throughout the country, and that's backed by the PGA Tour and the big players in the golf world. And I think that's what we need in golf to promote this, and set up these programs that are affordable and maybe subsidize these populations who have more barriers to accessing the sport. Because yeah, it does have a little higher of a stair or entry step, but like I show, continuing participation is not as expensive as popular belief. So yeah.
Thank you. Jonathan, do you have any comments?
Yeah, I can be really quick with it, but I think I mean, this question gets into like the whole reason I did the research in the first place, is to provide public health professionals some evidence into the benefits of playing pickleball. And so then being able to say, you should get into a sport because you need to get a little bit of physical activity. It might help to meet some friends, all this stuff, to then partner with public park and recreation agencies to be familiar with the opportunities that they can have. If we're talking about seniors, also looking at some of the senior centers and knowing that pickleball or other sports and recreational activities are an option for achieving physical activity and health outcomes.
Wonderful, wonderful. That brings us to 1:30 and our closing time. I want to thank our speakers today. They were very interesting and informative talks. Thank you for taking this time to put these together and come be in our symposium.